It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon in the small town of Brooksville, a place where everyone knew each other's name and the pace of life seemed almost frozen in time. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, their facades worn by years of history. In the center of town stood a small, unassuming pizzeria, Bella's Pizza, a place that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Its red and white checkered floors, the warm scent of tomato sauce and melted cheese, and the laughter of the occasional customer gave it a comforting familiarity. It was the heart of the community in many ways, where locals gathered to share stories, jokes, and the occasional slice of pizza. Behind the counter, a group of friendly employees went about their work, chatting as they kneaded dough, slid trays into the oven, and worked the cash register. Among them was Sarah, a bubbly 25-year-old with a smile that could light up the room. She'd been working at Bella's for a few years and had gotten to know most of the regulars by name. But there was one customer who stood out more than the others. His name was Thomas, though most people just called him Tom. Tom was an older man, probably in his late 40s, with a scruffy beard and thick glasses. He had a quiet presence about him, a man of few words. He didn't fit the typical profile of the average pizza lover in town. He wasn't loud or boisterous like the usual crowd. He didn't bring in a large group of friends to share a table, nor did he ever celebrate anything special. Instead, he came in alone, almost every day, at exactly the same time, 5:30 p.m. without fail. He had one order, and one order only, a large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese and a side of ranch dressing. The employees had grown accustomed to his routine. He was always polite but distant, never staying long enough to chat or make small talk. He would grab his pizza, pay in cash, and leave as quickly as he came. The only thing that stood out about Tom was his unwavering consistency. No matter the weather, no matter the day of the week, Tom was there. And yet, despite being a regular for years, he remained something of a mystery. Sarah had noticed the pattern for a while, but it wasn't until one rainy evening in late autumn that she began to question it. That evening, the pizzeria was quiet, just Sarah and a couple of the other employees working. The storm had kept most of the regulars home, leaving the place unusually empty. When Tom walked in at 5:30, just like always, Sarah greeted him with her usual friendly smile. But this time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about him. His usual calm demeanor seemed a bit more withdrawn, and his eyes, usually focused on the ground or the pizza in his hands, appeared more distant, almost lost. "Hi, Tom. The usual today?" Sarah asked as she rang up his order. Tom nodded, but instead of his usual casual response, he paused for a moment before speaking. "Yeah, just the usual." "Thanks, Sarah," he said, his voice a little shakier than normal. Sarah gave him a questioning look, her curiosity piqued. "Everything okay?" she asked gently, trying to sound casual but concerned. Tom was one of the quietest customers, and to hear even the slightest tremor in his voice was unusual. Tom hesitated, then shook his head slowly. "Just been a rough day. Nothing you need to worry about." Sarah didn't push him further, respecting his privacy. She handed him his pizza, and he walked out of the door as quickly as he had entered, the bell above the door chiming softly as it swung shut behind him. But as Sarah watched him leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. It wasn't just his tone or the subtle way his hands trembled as he grabbed his pizza, it was the emptiness in his eyes. She had seen that look before, but she couldn't quite place where. It was as if Tom had lost something, something deep, something that couldn't be fixed with a pizza or a smile. For the next few days, Tom didn't show up at his usual time. At first, Sarah thought it was just an anomaly, maybe he had to work late or had other plans. But then the days stretched on, and the silence at 5:30 became more noticeable. By Friday, Sarah was starting to wonder if something had happened to him. It was unlike him to miss even one day, let alone an entire week. The following Monday, Tom returned. But it was clear that whatever had been bothering him the previous week hadn't been resolved. He looked even more exhausted, his shoulders hunched and his movements slow. When he walked in, Sarah immediately noticed the change. He wasn't wearing his usual jacket, the one that he'd always seemed to take comfort in. His hands were empty. He didn't even have his wallet out to pay. "Tom?" Sarah called out as he stood by the counter, staring down at the menu like he didn't know what to order. He was usually so decisive. Tom looked up, startled, his eyes wide as if he had forgotten where he was for a moment. "Oh. Just the usual," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Sarah smiled politely, but she couldn't help but notice the change. She glanced at the other employees, who were starting to notice as well. Something wasn't right. As she prepared his order, Sarah tried to make small talk, to bring him back to the world he had once seemed so comfortable in. But Tom was distant, unresponsive, his mind somewhere else entirely. When she handed him the pizza, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and Sarah felt a shock of something unexpected, an almost imperceptible jolt of electricity, as if she had touched something cold and fragile. She looked up at him, but Tom was already on his way out the door. He didn't even say goodbye. He just left. The next day, Sarah decided to ask around. She spoke to some of the other regulars at the pizzeria, trying to gather more information about Tom. She found out that, like many of the townsfolk, Tom was a quiet man who had lived in Brooksville for years. He didn't socialize much, didn't seem to have any close family or friends in town, and his job, a quiet desk job at a local office, didn't give him much of a social life. He had no wife, no kids, and no significant other. He wasn't an enigma, but there was something elusive about him, a quiet sorrow that followed him wherever he went. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Tom. It was as if his loneliness had somehow seeped into her, and she couldn't ignore it. Why did he come in every day for the same pizza? Was it just a comfort routine, or was there something more behind it? It was hard to imagine a man his age, someone who seemed so ordinary, carrying such a weight of sadness. But there was no doubt in Sarah's mind that something had changed in him. Something deep inside him had shifted, and she wasn't sure if it was a change he could ever come back from. But as the days passed, Sarah noticed something even more unsettling. Every time Tom came in, he seemed a little less like himself. Each day, he appeared more withdrawn, more distant, until one fateful Thursday afternoon, something happened that would change everything. Tom walked in for his usual pizza order, but when Sarah handed him the pizza, she caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were wide with something unrecognizable, and for the first time in all the years she'd known him, she saw something she hadn't expected. It was fear. Tom was afraid. And for the first time, Sarah realized that the man who had been a fixture in her life for so long was hiding something far darker than she had ever imagined. Something that was slowly, quietly, and irrevocably changing everything. The days following that Thursday were a blur for Sarah. The sudden change in Tom's demeanor had shaken her deeply, more than she cared to admit. She couldn't stop thinking about the fear she had seen in his eyes, something raw and primal that spoke volumes despite his attempts to mask it. It wasn't the first time Sarah had seen a person in distress, but it was different with Tom. She had known him long enough to sense when something wasn't right. This wasn't just a bad day or a passing moment of unease, this was something far more serious. She had to know what was going on. The next few days, Sarah found herself on edge, expecting Tom to show up at his usual time, but he didn't. The pizzeria seemed emptier without him. He had been such a consistent figure in their little town that his absence was almost tangible. It was like a piece of the place was missing. Sarah kept glancing at the clock at 5:30, hoping to see Tom walk through the door, but when it became clear that he wasn't coming, she felt a strange mix of relief and concern. What had happened to him? On Sunday afternoon, nearly a week after Tom had last visited, Sarah was working the counter alone. The lunch rush had passed, and she was wiping down tables when the door chimed. She looked up, half expecting to see a tourist or perhaps someone from out of town, but when she saw Tom standing there, her heart skipped a beat. He was different, darker, almost hollow, as if whatever had been bothering him had worsened in the days since. His eyes were sunken, his face pale, and his shoulders sagged like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "Tom," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She hadn't expected him to come back, let alone so soon. She took a step toward him, but stopped herself. There was something about his presence that made her instinctively pause. She could feel the tension in the air between them. Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood at the counter, staring at the menu like he was seeing it for the first time. Sarah knew he wasn't actually looking at the menu, his eyes were unfocused, lost in thought. She waited, giving him the space he needed, but the silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained, as though every word required tremendous effort. "I'll have the usual," he muttered, his eyes still not meeting hers. Just the usual, please." Sarah nodded and turned to prepare the pizza, her mind racing. She didn't know what had happened, but she could feel it in her bones. This was different. Tom wasn't the same man who had come in day after day, the man who had always kept to himself but never showed signs of this kind of weariness. She tried to make small talk as she worked, to fill the silence, but it was clear that Tom wasn't in the mood for conversation. "Tom, is everything okay?" she asked again, this time more gently, trying to break through the wall he had built around himself. She had to know if he was in trouble, if there was something she could do to help. The last thing she wanted was for him to suffer in silence, but at the same time, she didn't know if he would be willing to open up. Tom's eyes flickered briefly toward her, and for a split second, Sarah saw something in them, something that nearly made her heart stop. It wasn't just fear this time. It was panic, a sense of being cornered, trapped in a situation from which there was no escape. His gaze dropped again, and he mumbled, "I'm fine, Sarah. It's just been a long week, that's all." But Sarah wasn't buying it. There was something more going on, something deeper than just a long week. The way his hands trembled slightly as he placed his money on the counter was a dead giveaway that he was fighting some kind of internal battle. She could feel it, too, the sense that this was not a normal moment. That something was coming to a head. After a long pause, Sarah handed him his pizza, but before he could take it, she hesitated. "Tom, are you sure you're okay?" she asked one last time, her voice thick with concern. She couldn't just let him walk out like this, not with everything she had seen in him in the last few days. Tom seemed to waver for a moment, his eyes flickering with something like indecision. Then, without warning, he let out a deep sigh and slumped against the counter. For the first time in years, Sarah saw him as a man who was utterly defeated. His usual walls were gone, and in their place was a raw vulnerability that took her by surprise. "Sarah, Tom began, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm in trouble. Big trouble." Her heart skipped. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the urgency in her chest. She needed to know, to understand, and yet a part of her wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it. Tom glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone else was in the pizzeria. The other employees were in the back, and the shop was empty aside from them. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "It's not something I can talk about openly, not here. But I've been hiding something for a long time. Something I thought I could control. But it's out of my hands now." Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. "What are you talking about, Tom?" she asked softly, but she was already dreading the answer. She had a feeling she wasn't going to like what he was about to say. Tom hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I've been running from the past, Sarah. Running from something I did. And it's caught up with me. The people I hurt, they're not going to let me go. They're coming for me. And when they do, I'll be nothing more than a memory. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words were so heavy, so loaded with unspoken fear, that she almost couldn't process them. Tom had always been a quiet man, a man who kept to himself and never got involved in anything too serious. He had no family, no close friends, and had seemed like the least likely person to be carrying a dark secret. But now, as she looked at him, it all made sense. His quiet routine, the daily pizza, the way he kept to himself, it was all part of the mask he had created to hide from whatever he was running from. "Who's coming for you, Tom?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew this was a question that could change everything. She had no idea what kind of trouble he had gotten himself into, but the fear in his eyes told her that whatever it was bad. Tom shook his head, the weight of the world seemingly pressing down on him. "I can't tell you, Sarah. I don't want you involved in this. It's not safe." He paused, his eyes pleading with her. "Just forget what I said. I shouldn't have said anything. Just, please." But it was too late. Sarah couldn't just forget it. Whatever it was that Tom was hiding, it had already woven its way into her life, and she couldn't ignore it. The fear in his eyes, the way he looked like a man on the brink of collapse, it was too real. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't something that would go away on its own. "I won't forget, Tom," Sarah said firmly, though her voice trembled with a mixture of concern and determination. "But I can't help you if you won't tell me what's going on." Tom sighed, his shoulders slumping further. "I don't know how to fix this. It's too late. I can't change what I've done." Sarah wasn't sure if she could help him either, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let him face whatever was coming alone. Whatever he had done, whatever it was he was hiding, she was going to find out, and she wasn't going to walk away from him now. As Tom slowly walked out of the pizzeria, his pizza in hand, Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that Tom's story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And she had a feeling that, somehow, she was about to be dragged into the heart of it. The next few days were a blur for Sarah. The quiet rhythm of the pizzeria, which had always been a comforting part of her daily routine, suddenly felt out of place. Tom's absence weighed heavily on her mind. She found herself staring at the clock every time it neared 5:30 p.m., but he never showed up. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly as the usual customers came and went, their chatter and laughter filling the space around her, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Tom had disappeared into thin air, and with each passing day, she became more and more worried. By Thursday evening, she had nearly given up hope of seeing him again. He had been gone for almost a week, and despite her best efforts to reach out, there had been no sign of him. She had tried calling his phone a dozen times, left messages, but received nothing in return. It was as if he had vanished into the shadows. The thought of Tom, always so predictable, so dependable, just disappearing, leaving no trace behind, unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. As Sarah closed up the pizzeria that night, her mind raced. She was used to the quiet solitude that followed the end of the dinner rush, but tonight, her thoughts were louder than usual. She couldn't shake the image of Tom's face when he had spoken to her last. The desperation in his eyes had left an indelible mark on her memory. He had been trying to warn her, trying to shield her from whatever he was running from, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't just forget it. Something was happening, something bigger than she could comprehend, and Tom was caught in the middle of it. Just as she finished wiping down the last of the tables, the door to the pizzeria opened. Sarah looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, but her heart skipped a beat when she saw Tom standing there. He looked even worse than before, haggard, disheveled, and exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes rumpled, and there was a deep unease about him that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Tom," she whispered, almost in disbelief. She hadn't expected him to come back, not after all this time. He was standing there in the doorway, like a ghost, uncertain whether he should step inside or turn and walk away. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering around the room before settling on Sarah. I had to come, he said, his voice rough. I don't know what else to do. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen him like this before. He had always been reserved, quiet, even somewhat stoic, but now he seemed like a shell of the man he once was. It was clear that whatever he had been running from, it had caught up with him in a way that couldn't be ignored any longer. "Come in, Tom." "Please," Sarah said, stepping aside to let him through. Her mind was spinning with questions, but she knew that whatever was happening, he needed help. She couldn't stand by and do nothing. Tom walked in slowly, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He didn't speak for a moment, just stood there in the middle of the pizzeria, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Sarah didn't know what to say. She wanted to ask him what had happened, what had driven him to this point, but she could sense that now wasn't the time. He needed to open up on his own terms, and she had to be patient. After a few long moments of silence, Tom finally spoke. "I don't know how to say this, Sarah, but," he paused, as if gathering the strength to continue. "I've been lying to you. I've been lying to everyone. For a long time now." Sarah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. She had never seen him this vulnerable before. Whatever he had to say, it was going to change everything. Tom took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the counter. "I'm not just some guy who orders pizza every day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never was. There's more to me, more to my past, than you could ever imagine. And I've been running from it. I thought I could outrun it, but it's not possible. Not anymore." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the fear in his eyes, and it was contagious. Whatever Tom was about to reveal, it was something big, something that had been lurking in the shadows of his life, something that had finally caught up with him. "I've been involved in things," he continued, his voice cracking. "Things I'm not proud of. And now, they're coming for me. I thought I could leave it all behind, but the people I've crossed, they won't just let me go. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure I pay for what I've done." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process his words. What had he been involved in? What kind of people were after him? And why had he kept all of this from her? She had always known there was something more to Tom than met the eye, but she had never imagined it could be something like this. "You don't have to explain everything to me right now, Tom," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with empathy. "But you need to get out of here. Whatever's happening, it's not safe for you here anymore." Tom's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in them, a flicker of recognition, a silent understanding. "I can't run anymore, Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's too late for that. But I had to come back. I needed you to know the truth. I never wanted you to get caught up in this." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she reached out to him. "You're not alone, Tom. We'll figure this out together. You don't have to do this by yourself." But Tom shook his head, the sorrow in his eyes deeper than anything Sarah had ever seen. "It's too dangerous for you, too. I don't want to put you in harm's way. You deserve better than this." He paused, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry for everything. I never meant for any of this to happen." For a long moment, Sarah stood there, struggling to find the right words. She knew that Tom's life had been turned upside down, but she couldn't just walk away from him. Not now. Not when he was this vulnerable. She had known him for too long, and despite everything that had been revealed, she couldn't let him face whatever was coming alone. You don't have to apologize, Tom, she said softly. But you're right about one thing. You can't do this alone. We'll figure it out together. The silence that followed was thick with tension, and Sarah could feel the weight of Tom's fear pressing down on both of them. She had no idea what kind of danger they were about to face, but she knew one thing for certain: their lives were about to change forever. Whatever Tom had been running from, whatever secret had haunted him all these years, it was finally catching up with him, and now, it was catching up with both of them. And there was no turning back. As the hours passed, Sarah and Tom sat in the pizzeria, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of his confession. Tom's eyes were fixed on the counter, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the surface. Sarah, still reeling from what he had just shared, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of helplessness. The man she had known for so long, the one who had always been a reliable presence in her life, was now a stranger. A man tangled in a web of secrets and dangerous truths, a man who had been living a lie, and worse yet, he was in danger. The silence between them felt suffocating. Sarah wanted to ask more questions, but she knew it wasn't the right time. Tom needed to process everything. He needed to feel like he wasn't alone, and for that moment, she was determined to be there for him. She couldn't understand everything he was going through, but she could support him, and that was what mattered now. Tom took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as if he was trying to steady himself. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke again. "I'm not sure how much longer I have before they come for me," he said, his words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. "I've been running for years, hiding in plain sight, but I can't keep doing this forever. It's only a matter of time before they find me. They know who I am now, and they know I've been talking. Once they realize I've exposed myself, there's no turning back." Sarah's heart raced. She had known there was more to Tom's story, but hearing him say it so plainly made it all the more real. The thought of danger looming so close, threatening to consume him, sent a chill down her spine. She didn't want to believe it, but the look in his eyes told her that this wasn't some paranoid fantasy. This was real. And it was terrifying. "I don't know what to do," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we stop them? How do you get out of this?" Tom shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You can't stop them, Sarah. They're too powerful. They have too many connections. It's not just a few people looking for me. It's a whole network, and they'll stop at nothing to silence me." The desperation in his voice was palpable, and it cut Sarah to the core. She had never seen Tom like this before. He was always so controlled, so composed, but now he was unraveling in front of her, and it terrified her. She wanted to tell him everything would be okay, that they could fix it, but she didn't have the answers. There was no easy fix for this. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the back of the restaurant and the distant echo of traffic outside. It was a strange contrast to the chaos that was brewing in their lives. Sarah tried to collect her thoughts, but they kept slipping away, lost in the fog of uncertainty that had settled over her. What could she do? She wasn't equipped to fight the people who were after Tom. She didn't even know who they were. All she knew was that she had to protect him, even if it meant risking everything. As if reading her thoughts, Tom finally looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "You don't have to get involved, Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't want to drag you into this. It's dangerous, and I don't want you to get hurt because of me. You've done enough. You've helped me more than I could ever ask for, and now it's time for me to go." Sarah's heart clenched at his words. She couldn't just let him walk away again, not when he was this broken, not when she knew he needed her. She had to be there for him, no matter the cost. She stood up, her decision made. "No, Tom. You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady, even though her heart was racing. "I'm not going to let you face this alone. We'll figure this out together. I'm not going to walk away from you. Tom's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by her resolve. Sarah, you don't know what you're getting into, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. This isn't some small problem we can solve with a few phone calls. These people are dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. You can't protect me from them. I don't care how dangerous they are, Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. You've been there for me all this time, Tom. You've always been there when I needed you. Now it's my turn to be there for you. You don't have to face this alone. For a moment, Tom just stared at her, as if weighing her words. He looked exhausted, defeated even, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like hope. It was fleeting, but it was there, and for the first time since he had walked into the pizzeria that night, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this together. I don't deserve your help, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know what else to do. I can't do this alone. We'll figure it out, Sarah said, her words carrying a strength she didn't even know she had. But we need to move fast. We can't wait around for them to come to us. We need to find a way to protect you. Tom nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I don't know where to start. I've been running for so long, I've lost track of where I even stand in all of this. I need help, real help. But I don't know who I can trust anymore. Sarah thought for a moment, her mind racing as she tried to think of anyone who might be able to help. She had connections, friends, even distant relatives in law enforcement, but she wasn't sure who to turn to. She didn't want to risk putting anyone else in danger. The stakes were too high, and if she involved the wrong person, it could escalate things in ways they couldn't control. I'll find someone, she said finally, determination in her voice. We'll figure out a way to get you the help you need. She wasn't equipped to fight the people who were after Tom. She didn't even know who they were. All she knew was that she had to protect him, even if it meant risking everything. As if reading her thoughts, Tom finally looked up, his eyes locking with hers. You don't have to get involved, Sarah, he said, his voice soft but firm. I don't want to drag you into this. It's dangerous, and I don't want you to get hurt because of me. You've done enough. You've helped me more than I could ever ask for, and now it's time for me to go. Sarah's heart clenched at his words. She couldn't just let him walk away again, not when he was this broken, not when she knew he needed her. She had to be there for him, no matter the cost. She stood up, her decision made. No, Tom. You're not going anywhere, she said, her voice steady, even though her heart was racing. I'm not going to let you face this alone. We'll figure this out together. I'm not going to walk away from you. Tom's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by her resolve. Sarah, you don't know what you're getting into, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. This isn't some small problem we can solve with a few phone calls. These people are dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. You can't protect me from them. I don't care how dangerous they are, Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. You've been there for me all this time, Tom. You've always been there when I needed you. Now it's my turn to be there for you. You don't have to face this alone. For a moment, Tom just stared at her, as if weighing her words. He looked exhausted, defeated even, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like hope. It was fleeting, but it was there, and for the first time since he had walked into the pizzeria that night, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, they could make it through this together. I don't deserve your help, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know what else to do. I can't do this alone. We'll figure it out, Sarah said, her words carrying a strength she didn't even know she had. But we need to move fast. We can't wait around for them to come to us. We need to find a way to protect you. Tom nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I don't know where to start. I've been running for so long, I've lost track of where I even stand in all of this. I need help, real help. But I don't know who I can trust anymore. Sarah thought for a moment, her mind racing as she tried to think of anyone who might be able to help. She had connections, friends, even distant relatives in law enforcement, but she wasn't sure who to turn to. She didn't want to risk putting anyone else in danger. The stakes were too high, and if she involved the wrong person, it could escalate things in ways they couldn't control. I'll find someone, she said finally, determination in her voice. We'll figure out a way to get you the help you need. Tom didn't argue. He knew the stakes, and as much as he hated to admit it, he knew Sarah was right. They couldn't risk being found. The apartment was bare, almost empty, save for the essentials, a bed, a few chairs, and a table. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They'd make it work, for now. Sarah didn't tell anyone where Tom was staying. She couldn't afford to trust anyone outside their small circle. Even the people closest to her were potential threats. As much as it pained her to keep things secret, she knew she had to. Every conversation had to be carefully guarded, every decision made with caution. There was no room for error. Tom, however, wasn't used to hiding. He had spent years building a life under false pretenses, creating an image of normalcy that now seemed like a distant memory. His days of living in the open, of walking freely through the world, had come to an end. He was no longer a man with a predictable routine, but a fugitive, constantly looking over his shoulder, always aware of the danger lurking just beyond the horizon. At night, Sarah would visit him at the apartment, bringing food, water, and whatever else he needed. They spent their evenings talking about everything and nothing, trying to keep the tension at bay. Tom would sometimes tell her stories of his past, bits and pieces of his life before everything had changed. His stories were fractured, incomplete, as if he was still trying to make sense of it all. But Sarah listened, not judging, just being there. One night, as she sat on the worn-out couch in the corner of the apartment, she looked over at Tom, who was sitting in the chair across from her, his eyes distant and lost in thought. She could see the toll this was taking on him, the fatigue, the fear, the constant battle with his own mind. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen before. It was a flicker of hope. A desire to fight back, to take control of his life again. Do you ever think about going back to your old life? Sarah asked quietly. Tom's eyes snapped to hers, a flash of emotion crossing his face. I think about it every day, he admitted. But it's not possible. I can't go back to what I was. Not after everything I've seen. Not after what I've done. Sarah nodded, her heart aching for him. She knew he wasn't talking about a simple career change or moving to a new town. What he had done, what he had been involved in, ran deeper than anything she could truly comprehend. And yet, she could see how much he regretted it. She could see the weight of his actions, how it burdened him in ways words couldn't describe. Maybe you don't have to go back, Sarah said softly, her voice filled with an unexpected conviction. Maybe you can still build something new. Something that's yours, something that can't be taken away. Tom looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of disbelief and longing. You really think that's possible? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah met his gaze, her own heart heavy with doubt, but she forced herself to speak the words. I don't know. But I know that you're still here. And as long as you're still here, you have a chance. There was a long silence between them as Tom absorbed her words. For the first time in a long time, he seemed to soften, his shoulders relaxing, the tension slowly leaving his face. He let out a deep breath, as if he had been holding it in for too long. I don't know if I deserve that chance, he said quietly. I've hurt a lot of people, Sarah. I've been part of something that I can't undo. I don't know if I can ever make up for what I've done. You don't have to make up for everything, Sarah said gently. But you do have to make the choice to change. To fight for something better. For yourself. Tom looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find the truth in her words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Maybe there's a chance, even if it's a small one. The conversation marked a turning point for Tom. Something shifted inside him, a quiet determination that had been buried under years of fear and guilt. For the first time in a long time, he began to believe that there might be a way out of the darkness. It wasn't going to be easy, but Sarah had given him a glimpse of hope. A hope he thought had died long ago. But even as Tom began to grapple with his newfound sense of possibility, the danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. They had to be careful. One wrong move, one slip-up, and it could all come crashing down. The people he had crossed were relentless, and they didn't take kindly to betrayal. One evening, as Sarah arrived at the apartment with groceries in hand, she felt an unusual chill in the air. It wasn't just the cold, but something else, a sense of being watched. She shook off the feeling, blaming it on the stress of the past few days, but the unease stayed with her. When she knocked on the door, there was no answer. Tom was usually there, waiting for her. But tonight, the apartment was eerily quiet. "Tom," she called softly, pushing the door open. There was no response. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The apartment was empty, except for one thing. A small envelope lay on the table, sealed with a symbol she didn't recognize. Her stomach twisted in knots as she picked it up, the paper feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her hands. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the words inside. The note was short, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through her. "We know where you are. You can't hide forever. It's only a matter of time." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She'd known it wouldn't be long before they found him, but now that it was real, the gravity of the situation hit her like a freight train. Tom was in even more danger than she had realized. And now, so was she. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, expecting to find Tom standing in the doorway. But it wasn't him. It was someone else. The man standing in the doorway was tall, his features obscured by a dark hood, but his presence was unmistakable. Sarah's blood ran cold as he stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. She didn't recognize him, but she could feel the danger radiating from him. He wasn't here for small talk. He was here for something much more sinister. "Where is he?" the man asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah's mind raced. She had to think quickly. If she didn't, this could be the end of everything. The end of Tom's chance at redemption, and her own life. The silence between Sarah and the man who stood in the doorway felt suffocating, the tension thick enough to slice through with a knife. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she faced him, trying to control her breath, her mind racing to think of any possible way out. The man didn't move, he just stared at her with cold, calculating eyes, as though he could see straight through her. Sarah's thoughts were a blur, her instincts screaming at her to do something, anything. But what? She couldn't betray Tom. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "Where is he?" the man repeated, his voice chillingly calm. His words hung in the air, weighted with an unspoken threat. It wasn't a question, it was a command. Sarah forced herself to stand tall, trying to mask the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She took a step back, her gaze never leaving the man's face. She knew she couldn't let him see how terrified she was. If she showed any sign of weakness, he would know. She had to buy time. She had to think. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor she could feel in her hands. She prayed her words didn't sound as shaky as they felt. "I don't know who you're looking for." The man didn't seem to buy it. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just going to ask questions, he was going to make sure he got answers. "Don't play games with me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I know he's here. I've been watching you. You think you can hide him? You think you can protect him? You can't run from us." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to turn the situation around. She knew she was no match for him physically. If it came down to a fight, she would lose. She couldn't let him take her or Tom. She had to keep him talking, buy more time. "Why do you want him so badly?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man paused, his lips curling into a slight smile, but it wasn't a smile that brought comfort. It was a smile that promised pain, a smile that held a world of secrets. "Because he owes us," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "He made a deal, and now he needs to pay up. You think you can protect him, but it's too late. He's already in over his head, and no one can save him now." Sarah's mind was spinning. A deal? What kind of deal was he talking about? What had Tom gotten himself into? She had known there was more to his past than he had told her, but this? This was something far worse than she had imagined. "I'm not going to let you hurt him," she said, her voice firmer now, despite the panic bubbling up inside her. The man's expression darkened. He took another step forward, and this time, Sarah didn't move. She couldn't show him fear. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "You think you have a choice," he sneered. "You don't. No one does. Your little game is over. You're either going to tell me where he is, or I'll make you regret it." The words felt like a slap across her face. The threat was clear, and Sarah knew he wasn't bluffing. He would do whatever it took to get to Tom, and if she stood in his way, she would be the one to suffer. But there was something inside her, a quiet voice that told her she couldn't back down. She couldn't let this man intimidate her, no matter how much he scared her. She had to protect Tom. She had to protect herself. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, more forcefully this time. "If you want to get to him, you'll have to go through me first." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might strike her. He took another step forward, his hand reaching into his coat, and Sarah's heart froze. Was he going to pull out a weapon? But instead of drawing a gun, the man simply smirked and took a step back. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice almost mocking. "You think you can protect him? You think you can save him? It's too late for that. You're both already in too deep." Sarah's pulse quickened. What was he talking about? What had Tom done that had gotten him this deep into danger? She couldn't understand it. She had thought they were just running from some bad people, but this was something more. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. The world Tom had been involved in was darker than she had known. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "He's not the man you think he is." The man's smile faded, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "He's a traitor," the man said, his voice suddenly cold. "He betrayed us. And now, he's going to pay the price." Sarah's stomach churned. A traitor? Was that really what Tom was? She couldn't believe it. She refused to believe it. Tom wasn't a bad person. He had made mistakes, sure, but he was trying to change. She had seen it in him. She had believed in him. "You're wrong," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He's trying to make things right. He's not your enemy." The man's expression darkened again, and he took another step toward her. "You really don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice like gravel. "You think you're saving him, but you're just delaying the inevitable. The people he's crossed won't let him go. Not now. Not ever. Sarah felt a sudden wave of despair wash over her. It was all too much. She had tried to protect him. She had tried to believe in the good inside him. But now, standing in front of this man, she saw the full extent of the danger they were in. Tom's past was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And no matter how hard she tried, it felt like they were already too far gone to escape. But even in the face of that crushing reality, Sarah knew one thing. She couldn't give up. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions. She had to fight, for Tom, for herself, for the chance at a better life that they both deserved. Whatever it takes, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. I won't let you take him. The man paused, his eyes narrowing once more. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension, neither of them willing to back down. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know how much longer they could stay hidden, how much longer they could outrun the past that was chasing them. But she did know one thing, she wouldn't give up on Tom. Not now. Not ever. As the door closed behind the man, Sarah sank down onto the couch, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. What had she just witnessed? Was it really over? Would Tom ever be free? Her mind was spinning, but one thing was certain, she was in this fight until the end. The war for their future had just begun. And Sarah was ready for whatever came next.